In this video, I'm going to be narrating 9 scary stories to tell in the dark. There was recently a movie made based on some of these stories, and it was pretty average. So I'm going to share with you some of the original stories to show you where it all began. Be sure to subscribe, it acts as protection against evil spirits. It's a proven fact, trust me on this guys. And let's jump into the first story. The Thing. There were 2 young boys named Trevor and Will. They spent most of their summer vacation hanging around town, looking for things to do. One hot night in August, the boys were sitting on a fence by the main road. There was a cornfield just across the road. Suddenly, Trevor spotted something in the field. In the darkness, it was difficult to make out, but he thought it looked like some kind of weird animal. He nudged his friend and pointed in the direction of the strange-looking figure. Will said he could see it too. He wasn't sure, but the mysterious thing seemed vaguely human. The next thing they knew, the thing was gone. The boys craned their neck and scanned the field with their eyes, and out of the darkness came the thing. It slowly walked over to the edge of the field before disappearing again. Trevor and Will looked at each other, puzzled. "What was that?" asked Will. "I have no idea," replied Trevor. No sooner had he said that than Trevor felt a clammy hand on his shoulder. He turned around and found himself staring directly into the hideous face of the thing. He let out a yell of terror and surprise. The rotting skin on the thing's face was coming off in places, revealing bone underneath. For a moment, it just stared silently at Trevor with its dark, sunken eyes. Then, it suddenly grabbed hold of his arm. Trevor felt its fingernails digging into his flesh as he wriggled out of its grasp. The 2 boys leapt off the fence and ran down the road, screaming in horror. They didn't stop running until they reached their homes. They tried to tell their parents and friends about the thing they had seen that night, but nobody believed them. When Trevor woke up the next morning, the scratches on his arm were still there. After a few days, they got worse and worse. Trevor got sick, and his parents took him to see a doctor. After examining his arm, the doctor told the boy it was infected and gave him some pills to take. Unfortunately, Trevor's condition got worse and worse. The infection spread to his entire arm, and it wasn't long before his flesh was rotting and falling off. He was taken to hospital, but no matter what the doctors did, no treatment seemed to work. The infection spread throughout his entire body. Trevor was confined to bed and started to waste away. It seemed like he was beyond help, and as the days went by, he steadily grew worse and worse. His anguished parents could only sit at his bedside and cry as they watched their beloved son slowly rotting away before their eyes. On the day that Trevor finally passed away, Will came to the hospital to visit him. When the boy walked into the hospital room and saw Trevor lying in bed, he was horrified. His friend looked exactly like the thing. Just a quick interlude before the next story. I'm going to be using dip pens, paintbrushes, and ink to render this picture. I wanted to emulate the look from the illustrations from the original book, and I thought pen and ink would be a really cool way to do that. You'll notice some of the facial expressions and proportions look pretty whack in these pictures, but that's intentional. I tried to stay true to the original illustrations. Maybe people were just really ugly back then, because damn, that girl with the spiders on her face. I mean, even without the spiders on her face, she was pretty terrifying. On that note, let's jump into the next story. The Red Spot. One night, a young girl was sleeping in her bed when a spider crawled across her face. It stopped for a few minutes on her left cheek, then it went on its way. When she woke up the next morning and looked in the mirror, she noticed a red spot on her cheek. "What is this?" she asked her mother. "It looks like a spider bite," her mother replied. "It will go away, just don't scratch at it." Soon, the small red spot grew into a big red boil. "Look at it now," the girl said. "It's getting bigger." "That sometimes happens," her mother said. "It's coming to a head." In a few days, the red spot was even larger. "Look at it now," the girl said. "It hurts so much, and it makes me look so ugly." "We'll have the doctor look at it," her mother said. "Maybe it's infected." But the doctor couldn't see the girl until the next day. That night, she decided to take a nice, relaxing bath. As she lay soaking in the warm water, the boil suddenly burst. Out poured a swarm of tiny spiders from the eggs their mother had laid in her cheek. Harold. When it got hot in the valley, Thomas and Alfred drove their cows to a cool, green pasture in the mountains to graze. Usually they stayed there with the cows for 2 months, then they brought them down to the valley again. The work was easy enough, but oh, it was boring. All day the 2 men tended their cows. At night, they went back to the tiny hut where they lived. They ate supper and worked in the garden and went to sleep. It was always the same. Then Thomas had an idea that changed everything. "Let's make a doll the size of a man," he said. "It would be fun to make, and we could put it in the garden to scare away the birds." "It should look like Harold," Alfred said. Harold was a farmer they both hated. They made the doll out of old sacks stuffed with straw. They gave it a pointy nose like Harold's, and tiny eyes like his. Then they added dark hair and a twisted frown. Of course, they also gave it Harold's name. Each morning, on their way to the pasture, they tied Harold to a pole in the garden to scare away the birds. Each night they brought him back inside so that he wouldn't get ruined if it rained. When they were feeling playful, they would talk to him. One of them might say, "How are the vegetables growing today, Harold?" Then the other, making believe he was Harold, would answer in a crazy voice, "Very slowly." They would both laugh, but not Harold. Whenever something went wrong, they took it out on Harold. They would curse at him, even kick him, or punch him. Sometimes one of them would take the food they were eating, which they were both sick of, and smear it on the doll's face. "How do you like that stew, Harold?" he would ask. "Well, you'd better eat it, or else." Then the two men would howl with laughter. One night, after Thomas had wiped Harold's face with food, Harold grunted. "Did you hear that?" Alfred asked. "It was Harold," Thomas said. "I was watching him when it happened. I can't believe it." "How could he grunt?" Alfred asked. "He's just a sack of straw. It's not possible." "Let's throw him in the fire," said Thomas. "And that will be that." "Let's not do anything stupid," said Alfred. "We don't know what's going on. When we move the cows down, we'll leave him behind. For now, let's just keep an eye on him." So they left Harold sitting in a corner of the hut. They didn't talk to him or take him outside anymore. Now and then, the doll grunted, but that was all. After a few days, they decided there was nothing to be afraid of. Maybe a mouse or some insects had gotten inside of Harold and were making those sounds. So Thomas and Alfred went back to their old ways. Each morning they put Harold out in the garden, and each night they brought him back into the hut. When they felt playful, they joked with him. When they felt mean, they treated him as badly as ever. Then one night, Alfred noticed something that frightened him. "Harold is growing," he said. "I was thinking the same thing," Thomas said. "Maybe it's just our imagination," Alfred replied. "We have been up here on this mountain too long." The next morning, while they were eating, Harold stood up and walked out of the hut. He climbed up on the roof and trotted back and forth like a horse on his hind legs. All day and all night long, he trotted like that. In the morning, Harold climbed down and stood in a far corner of the pasture. The men had no idea what he would do next. They were afraid. They decided to take the cows down into the valley that same day. When they left, Harold was nowhere in sight. They felt as if they had escaped a great danger and began joking and singing. But when they had gone only a mile or two, they realized they had forgotten to bring the milking tools. Neither one wanted to go back for them, but the tools would cost a lot to replace. "There really is nothing to be afraid of," they told each other. "After all, what could a doll do?" They drew straws to see who would go back. It was Thomas. "I'll catch up with you," he said, and Alfred walked on towards the valley. When Alfred came to a rise in the path, he looked back for Thomas. He did not see him anywhere, but he did see Harold. The doll was on the roof of the hut again. As Alfred watched, Harold kneeled and stretched out a bloody skin to dry in the sun. High beams. As the woman drove down a deserted highway, she noticed a lone pair of headlights quickly approaching her car from behind. When the car came closer, she noticed it was going to overtake her. The car drew up beside her, but then the driver suddenly swerved back behind her car. She started getting nervous and kept an eye on the strange car in her rear-view mirror. He pulled up dangerously close to her rear bumper and began flashing his high beams at her. The headlights dimmed for a moment, but then the high beams flashed again, and the car behind her surged forward. The car followed her very closely, and on tight curves or over hills, he would flash his high beams on and off. The frightened woman struggled to keep her eyes on the road and fought the urge to keep looking at the car behind her. Finally, she approached her exit, but the car continued to follow, flashing the high beams again and again. The terrified woman took out her mobile phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, the woman screamed into the phone, "A car is following me. He keeps tailgating and blinking his lights at me." The woman gave her address, and in a few minutes she saw the red and blue lights of a police car in the distance. She breathed a sigh of relief as she pulled into her driveway, but suddenly the strange car pulled into the driveway behind her and began blinking his lights on and off like a maniac. The police car screeched to a halt on the woman's front lawn, and 2 police officers jumped out with their guns drawn. They pulled the man out of the strange car and forced him to lie face down on the lawn. Then they handcuffed him as he screamed, "There's someone in her car!" The 2 policemen suddenly pointed their guns in the woman's direction and fired. The woman screamed, but when she turned around, she saw the bloody corpse of a murderer fall out of her back seat. There was a large butcher knife still clasped in his cold, dead hand. The police searched her back seat and found duct tape, a blindfold, and a pair of handcuffs lying there. The woman realized that the man in the strange car had been trying to save her. When the police released him, he explained that, as he pulled up behind her car and his headlights lit up her back seat, he had seen a man with a butcher's knife rising up behind her. Just as the madman was about to stab her, he flashed his high beams, and the figure crouched back down. "I flashed my high beams every time I saw him raise the knife," he said. The Big Toe. One day, a boy was digging in his garden when he saw a big toe sticking out of the ground. He tried to pick it up, but it was stuck. It wouldn't budge, so he pulled as hard as he could, and it came off in his hand. Then he heard something groan and scamper away. The boy took the big toe into the kitchen and showed it to his mum. "That looks like a nice piece of meat," she said. "I'll put it in the soup and we'll have it for dinner." That night, at the dinner table, the boy's father scooped out the big toe of the soup and chopped it up into 3 pieces. The father, the mother, and the boy each ate a piece. Then they did the dishes, and when it got dark, they went to bed. The boy fell asleep almost at once, but in the middle of the night, he was rudely awakened by a strange sound. He listened closely. It sounded like there was a voice coming from outside his window, and it was calling to him. "Where is my big toe?" it groaned. When the boy heard that, He got very scared, but he thought, it doesn't know where I am. It'll never find me. Then he heard the voice once more, only now it was closer. Where is my big toe? It groaned once more. The boy pulled the blankets over his head and closed his eyes. I'll go to sleep, he thought. When I wake up, it will be gone. But soon he heard the back door open, and again he heard the voice. Where is my big toe? The voice groaned once more. The boy watched in horror as his bedroom door opened. Shaking with fear, he threw his bedclothes over his head and listened as the footsteps slowly moved through the dark towards his bed. The boy watched in horror as his bedroom door opened. Shaking with fear, he threw his bedclothes over his head and listened as the footsteps slowly moved through the dark towards his bed. Then they stopped. Where is my toe? The voice groaned. You've got it. The creature pulled the blankets off of the boy, who was lying petrified in bed. The boy is so frightened, he can't move. He just lies there, staring up at the creature above him. Finally, he asks, What you got such big eyes for? The creature answers, To look you through and through. What you got such big claws for? To scratch up your grave. What you got such a big mouth for? To swallow you whole. What you got such sharp teeth for? To chomp your bones. The Hook. One summer night, a teenage boy was going out on a date with his new girlfriend. He picked her up at her house and they drove out to the edge of town. They parked the car in a well-known spot that was a lover's lane. As they gazed out at the lights of town, the boy put his arm around the girl and switched on the car radio so they could listen to some romantic music. He leaned over, and the young couple began kissing and cuddling. Just as they were getting into the mood, the music suddenly stopped, and a newsreader's voice came on the radio. This is an emergency announcement. Earlier tonight, a crazed murderer escaped from the state mental asylum. Police are warning citizens to be on their guard since the patient is considered armed and dangerous. The insane killer is nicknamed the Hook Man because after he lost his right hand in an accident, it was replaced with a steel hook. Everyone in the area should be on the lookout for a man fitting this description. If you see anything suspicious, you should report it to the police immediately. The girl became frightened and asked to be taken home. She knew that the state asylum was not far from the Lover's Lane. She was also worried that the remote area where they were parked was the perfect spot for a deranged madman to lurk. The boy was feeling brave and assured his girlfriend that they were perfectly safe. He locked all of the car doors, then tried to kiss her again. The girl became frantic and pushed him away, insisting that they leave immediately. In a huff, the boy slammed the car into gear and spun its wheels as he pulled out of the parking space. On the way back to town, they both calmed down but the girl still held on tightly to her boyfriend. When they pulled up outside the girl's house, the boy got out of the car and walked around to open the door for his girlfriend. For a long time, he just stood there, staring at the door. At first, the girl couldn't figure out what was wrong. Then she realized that the door was still locked. She smiled and unlocked it. Still, the boy just stood there. The girl was puzzled and rolled down her window. Then she saw that the boy was staring down at the door handle. Slowly, she looked down herself and began to scream uncontrollably. There, hanging from the door handle, was a bloody stainless steel hook. The Haunted House. One time, a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in his settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they would always get scared out by the haunt. So this preacher took his Bible and went to the house, went on in, built himself a good fire, and lit a lamp and sat there reading the Bible. Then just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. Then it sounded like somebody was trying to scream and got choked off. Then there was a lot of thrashing around and struggling, and finally everything got quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back, easy-like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and rested a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and went to mend the fire. The haunt started walking again, and step, step, step up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door, saw the doorknob turn and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed, like she didn't know what to do, then just faded out. The old preacher waited, and when he didn't hear any more noises, he went over and shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man, and he'd thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again. Slowly, step, 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 closer and closer, step, step. And it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him. Then the doorknob slowly turned, and the door opened wide. This time, the preacher spoke quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you, and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room, straight to him, and took hold of his coat. It was a young woman, about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled, and the flesh was dropping off her face, so he could see the bones and part of her teeth. She had no eyelids, but there was a sort of blue light back in her eye sockets, and she had no nose to her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing it. She told how her lover killed her for her money and buried her in the cellar. She had said if the preacher could dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. Then she told him to take the end joint of her little finger from her left hand and to lay it in the collection plate at the next church meeting, and he'd find out who had murdered her. And she said, "If you come back once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hidden, and you can give it to the church." The haunt sobbed like she was tired and sunk down towards the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at the bone, trying to get it off. Then he went to screaming like he was going crazy. Well, he confessed to the murder, and they took him to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to the house one midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the hearth rock. He did, and he found a big stack of money, and where the haunt had held on to his coat, the print of those bony fingers was burned right into the cloth. It never did come out. The Dream. Lexi Morgan had a dream. She was walking up a dark staircase, and when she got to the top, she walked into a bedroom. The bedroom carpet was made up of large squares that looked like trapdoors, and each of the windows was fastened shut with nails that stuck up out of the wood. In her dream, Lexi went to sleep in the bedroom, but during the night, a woman with a pale face, black eyes, and long black hair slipped silently into the room. She leaned over the bed and whispered, "This is an evil place. Run away while you still can." Then the black-haired woman grabbed her arm. Lexi Morgan woke up with a scream and lay awake the rest of the night, shivering and shaking with fear. In the morning, she told her landlady that she had decided not to go to Kingston after all. "I can't tell you why," she said, "but I just can't bring myself to go there." "Then why don't you go to Dorset?" the landlady asked. "It's a pretty town, and it's not too far." So Lexi Morgan went to Dorset. Someone told her she could find a room in a house at the top of the hill. It was a pleasant-looking house, and the landlady there, a plump, motherly woman, was nice as could be. "Let's look at the room," the lady said. I think you will like it." They walked up a dark, curved staircase, like the one in Lexi's dream. In these old houses, the staircases are all the same, Lexi thought. But when the landlady opened the door to the bedroom, it was the room in her dream, with the same carpet that looked like trapdoors, and the same windows fastened with big nails. "This is just a coincidence," Lexi told herself. "How do you like it?" the landlady asked. "I'm not sure," Lexi said. "Well, take your time," the landlady said. "I'll bring up some tea while you think about it." Lexi sat on the bed, staring at the trapdoors and big nails. Soon there was a knock on the door. "It's the landlady with tea," she thought. But it wasn't the landlady. It was the lady with the pale face and black eyes and long black hair. Lexi Morgan grabbed her things and fled. The Red Ribbon. Bill whistled as he strolled through the park. He was on his way to meet his girlfriend, Sally. He could smell spring in the air. He jingled the engagement ring in his pocket and thought about asking Sally to marry him. Sally sat down on a park bench, and Bill knelt in front of her. "Sally," Bill said, "you were the most beautiful girl I've ever met. I love you, and I want you to be my wife. Will you marry me?" Sally laughed and said, "Yes, I will marry you." As Bill gazed lovingly at his bride-to-be, his eyes lingered on the red velvet ribbon Sally always wore around her neck. "Why do you always wear that red ribbon?" Bill asked. Sally said, "Bill, I must never take off my red ribbon." Bill smiled at Sally and left the ribbon alone. Bill and Sally were married that June. Bill found a lovely little house in a nice neighbourhood, and they moved in. Bill bought Sally many party dresses, but Sally always wore her red ribbon with each outfit. Bill thought it was a little odd. Sally just smiled and said, "I must never take off my red ribbon." After a few years, Sally found out she was going to have a baby. This news delighted Bill. Sally talked with her friends who had babies. Bill talked with his buddies who had children. They talked together later into the night about what they had learned from everyone. When the big day came, Sally said, "Please tell the doctor I must not take off my red ribbon." Bill was frustrated, but he promised Sally that he would tell the doctor. After the baby was born, Bill gave Sally flowers. "Thank you for the flowers, Bill," Sally said, "and thank you for telling the doctor I must not take off my red ribbon." Bill did not understand why the red ribbon was so important. "Do you want to hold little Billy?" she asked. Bill, Sally, and little Billy lived happily for many years in the small, lovely house in the nice neighbourhood. When little Billy was a baby, he would sometimes reach for the red ribbon around his mother's neck. Sally would gently take his little hands in hers and coo at him, saying, "Mummy must never take off her red ribbon." The red ribbon had frustrated Bill for a long time. He loved Sally with all his heart, but he did not understand her need to wear the red ribbon. After many years, Bill had an idea. "Our anniversary is coming up. I will buy Sally a beautiful necklace. She will take off that old red ribbon so she can wear the beautiful necklace." Their anniversary came. Bill took Sally to a fancy restaurant overlooking Central Park. They had a delicious meal. Then Bill gave Sally a velvet box with a beautiful diamond necklace in it. She opened it, smiled, and tears came to her eyes. Bill put the necklace around her neck and started to take off the red ribbon. Sally stopped him. She said, "I must never take off my red ribbon." Bill sat back in his seat with a huff. He looked at Sally and shook his head. "I may never understand," Bill said. Sally gently placed the diamond necklace back in the velvet box and closed the lid. "It is lovely, Bill. I will treasure it always," she said. "But I must never take off my red ribbon." "Why?" Bill asked, as he had for so many years. Sally smiled sadly and shook her head. She did not answer him. Late that night, Bill was still awake. "I've loved Sally for more than 20 years, but she insists on wearing that horrible red ribbon around her neck. I think it's about time I found out why." Bill got out of bed and walked around to Sally's side. Bill carefully pinched the ends of the bow on the ribbon. He began to slowly pull on the ribbon. The bow became smaller and smaller. The loops of the bow pulled through, and only half a knot was left. Bill slid his finger under the half knot and tugged. Zip! The red ribbon gave way. Pop! Sally's head came off. It rolled right to the floor, bouncing in the moonlight. One tear fell from Sally's eye. "I warned you," she said. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Did you have a favourite story out of those 9? There was some pretty gross ones there. The red spot, getting bitten by a spider and having eggs laid in your face. That's pretty disgusting. Definitely in the top 10 things I don't want to happen to me. If you want to support the channel, you can subscribe. I also have some limited hand-signed prints available. I'll leave a link down below if you want to buy a piece of my artwork and support the channel. That's a great way to do it. But I'll be back with another drawing video next week. I'll see you then. Bye.